No bridges, no roads to the mainland. For nearly 300 years, a string of islands off South Carolina and Georgia stayed cut off from the rest of the country. St. Helena, Sapelo, Wadmalaw, James Island, Hilton Head. Nothing but tidal marsh and open water stood between them and the mainland. Historians thought they knew exactly what that isolation preserved. One people, one coastline, unchanged since the ship that brought them. Then scientists sequenced the DNA. The results were strange. Strange enough that the research team went back and double-checked the numbers before they published them. This is what they found. Hit subscribe. The next reveal is bigger than the last one. This channel covers DNA, ancestry, and hidden history every week. Back to the Sea Islands. In 2021, 3 scientists ran the first full genetic scan of Gullah Geechee people. Their names were Kip Zimmerman, Theodore Schur, and Paula Ramos. They published it in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology. This kind of scan, called whole genome genotyping, means reading someone's entire genetic code, not just a small sample. Before this study, the story seemed settled. Sea Island planters had brought in people who knew how to grow rice in tidal marshes, so historians assumed Gullah ancestry came from one place, the so-called Rice Coast, meaning Sierra Leone, Guinea, Senegal, and Gambia. The Gullah aren't a tiny fading group. About 300,000 people still call themselves Gullah or Geechee today. They live across a corridor recognized by the federal government. It stretches from North Carolina down to Florida. Get the origin story wrong here, and you get an entire living population's ancestry wrong. One quick note. Gullah and Geechee aren't the same thing. Gullah usually means the South Carolina Sea Islands. Geechee usually means the Georgia and Florida coast. Same broad ancestry, 2 related but separate branches. Everyone agreed the genetic scan would just confirm the old story. Everyone was about to be wrong. The full genetic scan showed something surprising. The single biggest African ancestry group in Gullah DNA turns out to be Nigeria. Genetic markers linked to modern-day Nigeria make up 26 to 30% of Gullah African ancestry. That's the biggest slice. Sierra Leone comes in second, at around 18%. Now compare that to Charleston's own shipping records. Those old papers list West Central Africa as the biggest source at 39%. Nigeria barely shows up, just 5%. And it's not only Nigeria that doesn't match. West Central Africa runs the same mismatch in reverse. The shipping records call it the single biggest source of the trade, at that same 39%. But in the actual Gullah genome, West Central Africa shows up at only about 8%. But that gap wasn't even the strangest part. Here's why the numbers don't match. Many Gullah ancestors probably never sailed straight from Africa to Charleston. The DNA points to a second hidden route. Ships moving people in from British Caribbean islands like Jamaica and Barbados, or trade along the American coast itself. Historians have a name for this: the intra-American slave trade. That one fact flips the whole story. The Gullah Geechee weren't a single West African tribe, quietly preserved. Their DNA tells a different story. Several African nations forced together. Nigerian, Sierra Leonean, Senegambian, Central African, all merged on these islands, building something new. This is why geneticists call the Gullah Geechee a founding population, meaning their ancestry is a root source for many African Americans today. Their island stayed cut off, so their DNA stayed largely unmixed by the later trading that scrambled ancestry for almost everyone else. That means their DNA can be read in more detail than almost any other African American population. A Gullah descendant taking a DNA test today can trace their line to specific groups: Susu, Mende, Temne, Wolof. That kind of detail is rare. Think of it like this. You order one item online, the package arrives stuffed with things from 3 warehouses you never ordered from. The receipt says one supplier. The box says something else. That's the Gullah genome. The receipt, the old shipping records, says Sierra Leone made up 18%. The box, the actual DNA, says something bigger. Nigeria made up 26 to 30%, plus Sierra Leone, Senegal, and Central Africa all mixed in. The receipt wasn't just incomplete. It missed the biggest shipment by 6 times over. And Nigeria wasn't a one-time fluke. This same pattern shows up in every kind of DNA researchers checked. Watch the numbers repeat. First, mitochondrial DNA. That's the DNA passed down only from mother to child. Over 98% of it traces to African family lines. Scientists call these lines haplogroups. Less than 2% comes from anywhere else. Next, autosomal DNA. That's DNA from both parents mixed together. It showed 90.7% African ancestry in the Gullah. Compare that to 82.2% in a separate study of African Americans called the Jackson Heart Study. Last, the X chromosome. It carries an extra dose of maternal ancestry. It showed 93.4% African ancestry in the Gullah. That same comparison group showed 86.5%, 3 types of DNA, 3 separate tests, one answer every time. The Gullah Geechee carry one of the most well-preserved African genetic profiles ever recorded in North America. But African origin wasn't the only surprise. European admixture just means the percent of European DNA mixed in. In the Gullah genome, it's only 8.0%. Compare that to 16.3% in the Jackson Heart Study. That's more than double. So here's the obvious question. Slavery happened up and down the entire American South. Why would one group end up with less than half the European ancestry of people living just a few hours away? That question has a real answer, and it isn't the one most people guess. The popular assumption points to culture, religion, language, a strong leader keeping outsiders out. The real evidence is biological, and it takes 2 separate facts to prove it. Enslaved West Africans carried gene variants that protected against malaria, Duffy antigen negativity, and sickle cell trait. Here's the number. Duffy negativity sits near 90% in Gullah people today. Compare that to 68% in the broader comparison group, and just 3.5% in white Americans of European descent. White planters and overseers had none of these protections. Malaria killed them. That's the first piece of evidence. Here's the second. This isn't a one-time pattern from one county. It shows up separately in South Carolina and in Georgia. 2 different regions, the exact same pattern, driven by the exact same disease. That's not a coincidence. And isolation didn't just preserve DNA, it preserved knowledge too. Nature runs a version of this experiment all the time. 2 species living oceans apart, facing the same survival pressure, can land on the exact same solution completely on their own. Biologists call this convergent evolution. Same problem, same solution, no contact required. What happened on these islands is a cultural version of that idea. Look at the rice fields. The Sea Island rice economy ran on a system of wooden gates. The gates used the tide to push fresh water in and block salt water out. That same trick came from the West African coast. It had been used there for centuries. By the mid-1800s, this system produced over 150 million pounds of rice a year. Or the baskets. Sweetgrass baskets are still woven and sold today along Highway 17 in Charleston's historic city market. They use the same coiling technique as baskets made by the Wolof and Serer people of Senegal and Gambia. Enslaved workers first used them as winnowing fanners, tossing rice into the air so the coastal breeze could carry the husks away. Language survived the same way. Gullah Creole isn't broken English. It's a real language, formed when people without a shared tongue had to build one together. It has its own consistent grammar. The sentence structure borrows from West African languages, and much of the vocabulary comes from English. The word guba means peanut, tracing back to Central African languages. So does gumbo, which means okra. It took a translation team 26 years from 1979 to 2005 to translate the full Bible into Gullah. Today, only about 300 people speak Gullah fluently, with another 5,000 to 10,000 understanding it or speaking it in part. But the wider community that still claims this culture as their own runs past 250,000 people. The language is fragile. The community carrying it isn't. 3 very different areas of life: farming, craft, language. Same pressure, same solution, no matter which ocean you're standing on the other side of. That same idea also answers the question from a few minutes ago. The low European ancestry wasn't a cultural choice, and it wasn't random luck either. Autosomal DNA, the DNA from both parents, shows 8.0% European ancestry overall. But the X chromosome shows only 4.3%. Run that gap through a statistical model, and researchers estimate that almost all of the European ancestry here came from forced encounters between white men and enslaved African women, not from free relationships. Now here's a part that seems to contradict everything we just said. You might already be thinking it. If the Sea Islands were this isolated, why does the Gullah genome show a mix of Nigerian, Sierra Leonean, Senegambian, and Central African ancestry instead of just one? That's a fair question. Here's the key: the mixing came first. The isolation came after, locking everything in place. The genetic blending happened during the chaos of the slave trade itself, likely through Caribbean ports or coastal trading between colonies. This happened before these ancestors ever reached the Sea Islands. Once they arrived, isolation blocked any further mixing with outside groups for the next 300 years. So the mixed ancestry and the extreme isolation aren't a contradiction. They're two chapters of the same story, just in the right order. There's one more contradiction in this story, and it's never been fully solved. This one lives in the two words at the center of it. We'll get to that. Here's where the single origin story actually came from: the paperwork. Historians built the Rice Coast story mostly on Charleston's official shipping and cargo lists. Those are records of the legal, direct trade across the Atlantic, and they never included the illegal trade between American colonies. Ships bringing people in off the books from Jamaica, Barbados, and other British Caribbean islands. For 2 centuries, incomplete records got treated as the complete history. The paperwork wasn't exactly lying. It just never had access to a trade that wasn't supposed to exist in the first place. Full genetic scans are the first tool that can read the part the paperwork left out. But the shipping lists aren't the only place this story went quiet. There's a second silence hiding in the data, and it turns out to be the loudest part of the whole investigation. The most telling finding in this whole investigation is what's missing from the data. Sometimes what's hidden tells you more than what's left visible. There's almost no European ancestry on the maternal side, less than 2% after 2.5 centuries in America, and almost no Native American ancestry either. There's no wiping out of a clear African identity, which is exactly what the slave trade was designed to do. What the data found instead was a preserved family line, unbroken, running straight back to African women, still readable today. Slavery was built to strip people of their name, language, and origin. This much of the original signal survived anyway on American soil. That's the exception the system was never designed to allow. Here's the number that makes this personal: over 98%. That's the share of Gullah family lines, on the maternal side, that trace directly back to African family branches. Unbroken. Put that in human terms. That's an unbroken family line running back roughly 13 generations across the Atlantic to specific West and Central African women, still detectable in a simple cheek swab today. If you ever take one of these DNA tests yourself, this is the kind of clarity almost no other African American family gets. For a Gullah descendant, that 98% is real proof of a family story passed down for generations, now backed by hard science. So here's that unresolved question from a few minutes ago. Where does the word Gullah really come from? One theory says it comes from the Gullah people. They live near the Sierra Leone-Liberia border. Another theory says it's a short form of Angola. Old South Carolina records sometimes spelled it Ngullah. 2 believable origins, one African, one historical, and no written record proves either one for certain. Researchers are still working on it. That's part of what keeps this story alive. Let's make this real with 3 examples. Each one follows the same pattern: a common assumption, then what actually happened underneath it. Case 1. Mitchellville. In December 1862, the assumption was simple: formerly enslaved people would need someone else to run things for them. What happened was the opposite. They built their own government. Mitchellville on Hilton Head Island became the first self-governing black town in the United States, with an elected mayor, council members, a treasurer, and South Carolina's first law requiring school attendance, a full year before the Emancipation Proclamation was even signed. Case 2. Even a single Sea Island community holds more than one bloodline, sometimes within the same town. Look at two recorded family lines from this same region. One family traces back to a Sioux ancestor named Priscilla, recorded on the 1756 passenger list of the slave ship Hare, and later in the plantation records of Elias Ball. That paper trail was so complete, it survived 7 generations, all the way to a living descendant named Tomalin Martin Polite, who traveled to Sierra Leone in 2005. A second family recorded in Georgia in 1931 kept alive a 5-line funeral song sung in the Mende language by a woman named Amelia Dawley. The song stayed so exact that in 1997, her descendant Mary Moran matched it word for word to its home village, Senehun Ngola. Same broad community. 2 very different African origins sitting side by side. Case 3. Robert Smalls. The plantation and military system was built on one assumption: an enslaved man had no special skill worth fearing. In 1862, Smalls proved that wrong. He hijacked the Confederate warship Planter out of Charleston Harbor, wearing the captain's own straw hat and mimicking the ship's whistle signals to sail past 5 armed checkpoints, delivering the ship and freedom for his family and crew straight to the Union Navy. Different eras, different assumptions, same result. The real picture was always more complicated and more impressive than what people expected to find. Put those 3 cases next to the DNA data. Here's what the genetic scan actually proved wrong. Everyone already agreed the Gullah Geechee are African. The specific problem was the idea that they came from just one place, and that isolation meant a passive, unchanging history. Here's the new picture. The Gullah Geechee are a founding population. Their ancestors were forced together from several African nations. Then geography locked them in place, long enough for that blended identity to become permanent and unbroken. The old single origin story existed because the paperwork was incomplete, not because the science was ever really in doubt. The scientific truth is that this ancestry is real, well-preserved and traceable. The social story is different. Who belongs where? Which land counts as theirs? That's a separate argument. People decide that one, not genomes. Proving the single origin myth wrong doesn't erase what the Gullah Geechee still live through today. It changes where the story starts. It doesn't change how the story is still being fought. The same gene variants that once protected their ancestors from malaria are now a mismatch. Duffy negativity, sickle cell trait. Researchers think this mismatch may explain some of the highest known rates of lupus in Gullah communities. It may also connect to a higher risk of type 2 diabetes. A research project called SUGAR linked that risk to a specific spot on chromosome 14, and the land itself is still being fought over. In 1865, General Sherman signed an order, approved by President Abraham Lincoln, setting aside 400,000 acres of coastal land for freed families. Lincoln was assassinated just 3 months later, and President Andrew Johnson canceled the order, giving the land back to former Confederate owners. That betrayal still echoes today. On Hilton Head Island, Gullah-owned land has dropped from over 3,500 acres to under 700, and the black share of the island's population has collapsed from over 90% in 1940 to just 6% by 2020. Much of that land was never protected by a clear will in the first place. It passed down as heirs' property, jointly owned by hundreds of descendants with no single owner. Developers buy a tiny share from one distant relative, then file a lawsuit that forces the sale of the entire family's land at auction. It's a legal loophole sitting directly on top of a betrayal that started with Sherman's canceled land grants. On Sapelo Island, that same fight is happening right now. In 2023, county officials tried to more than double the allowed home size in Hog Hammock. That would have opened the door to a tax increase, raising property values from $27,500 to $145,000 per half acre. Residents pushed back. In a county-wide vote, 85% of residents rejected the change. Queen Quet, the chiefess of the Gullah Geechee Nation, advocates today for land rights and climate protection on a global stage. On Sapelo Island, Maurice Bailey leads efforts to bring back traditional crops like sapelo red peas. The DNA proves the ancestry survived. The land fight proves the survival isn't finished. This is happening right now. So when scientists finally mapped Gullah Geechee DNA, they weren't just filling a gap in a research paper. They were reading a message, written in blood, passed down for 13 generations, a message that slavery was never able to fully erase. One coastline assumed, many nations revealed. One family scattered across an ocean, still traceable as one family today. The paperwork told one story, the DNA told another, and the DNA was telling the truth the whole time. What happens next? Whether the land, the language, and the history survive another generation? That's still being written. If this changed how you think about American history, you already know what to do next.